So it's been well over 6 months since the release of the M4 Mac Minis, and I've been using this M4 Pro as my main computer for everything. And I mean everything. Everything from video editing to color grading, Photoshop, Blender, browsing, watching videos, 3D printing, Excel, Microsoft, a lot of stuff. So in this video, I want to talk about my experience of using this thing in detail and help you decide whether or not this is something you should consider buying for your workflow. So when it comes to the overall design and just the size of this thing, it is very impressive to say the least. It's not easy to fit all this power into this small chassis. And this thing being so small means it can fit on almost any desk setup. And it also looks good, which is nice. But this small size also comes with some potential drawbacks. One of them being cooling. As we saw in my last video about this Mac Mini, the throttling performance of this computer is not quite as good as the Mac Studio. While running Cinebench to specifically test for throttling, you could hear the fans on this thing within a few seconds, I think, of starting the test. While on the Mac Studio, I'd never heard the fans. It was just silent. And some of you seemed concerned about that in the comments of that video, that this Mac Studio or Mini potentially overheats. Well, I can tell you after using this for a couple of months, it's not really as big of a deal as you may think it is, because I haven't really heard the fans while using this thing for my work. I think as long as you're not pushing this thing to its absolute limit all the time, you're not gonna hear the fans. The second thing that may potentially be a problem for some of you, and it is for me, is the amount of ports this thing has. Don't get me wrong, it does have quite a few ports, but it doesn't have an SD card slot, which is something I use all the time. It's very important for me. So I had to use this thing with my USB-C dock, and I would recommend you to get one too anyways, because it also doesn't have a USB-A port. The Mac Studio, on the other hand, does have a USB-A port and an SD card slot. So there, I think everything is complete. Plus, this being a gigabit Ethernet port is kind of a bottleneck for my workflow because I use a NAS every single day. So I kind of need 10 gig or at least 2.5 gigs. You can upgrade this port to a 10 gig port for I think $100 extra, which is worth it in my opinion. Now, on the topic of things that are missing from this, one of the obvious ones is that this is a desktop Mac, so it doesn't come with any peripherals. You have to get your own keyboard, mouse, mic, webcam, everything. Now, these are some of the good ones that I would recommend because I personally use them and I trust them, but especially the webcam that I recently got and I've been using it, testing it. It's honestly one of the best webcams I have used so far. Seriously. What's special about it is that basically, you know how Apple's been adding center stage to pretty much all their devices where the webcam kind of crops in and it sort of tracks your head so that you don't go out of frame. This is basically that, but on steroids, because it doesn't crop in. It's literally on a gimbal, so you don't lose any quality. It has a 1.5-inch CMOS sensor, which can record at 4K 30 frames per second. And it does actually look really nice. Compared to my MacBook, there is a night and day difference. Like, it's not even close. It even has AI features, so you can control it with gestures, but I personally really like just how many options you have in the OBSBOT Center app. There are a ton of professional settings that you can customize to make this thing look the way you actually want it to. But it also has a basic mode, so if you don't know what half of these things mean, you won't get lost. And honestly, I'm kind of a fan of these gimbal webcams. I've been using one for a very long time. You may have noticed it in the background of my videos before I got this one, but this is even better than that. So I'm going to leave a link below. Check it out. I'll also drop links to my keyboard, mouse, and mic. Check those out as well. And thank me later. Now, one of my biggest pet peeves about the Mac Studio is the intake vent at the bottom. It collects a ton of dust, and within like a couple of weeks, I'll have a bunch of lint all built up around it and clogging the vent. For these Macs, you can't open them to clean them from inside, which sucks. This is not great for longevity because eventually a lot of dust will go inside this computer and it will make it heat up and it will throttle and slow down. That's not something you want. To be fair though, I think it's a little bit easier to open this Mac Mini compared to the Mac Studio, so we're taking steps in the right direction, but not there yet. Okay, let's talk about the performance, the most important thing. How does this thing actually perform? So in my last video, I showed you a bunch of benchmarks, and as we saw, compared to the M1 Max Mac Studio, this thing absolutely rips. It's significantly better, which was honestly a surprise to me, given the fact that this is a Pro chip and that's a Max chip. Sure, it's older, but it's a more superior chip. And for GPU, for example, this thing has fewer cores than the Mac Studio, yet performs better than that. So That was something I was not expecting at all. But what about real world usage? Well, this computer never felt slow at any given time. It's super fast, apps open almost instantly. 90% of the times I would say I did not feel like it was slowing down or lagging or anything like that. That 10%, however, there were a few times when Premiere Pro, my editing software, would crash due to just running out of memory. But at that point, it was also using like 40, 50 gigs, some crazy number like that. So it makes sense. But then just restarting Premiere Pro fixed the problem. Now comparing it to my M1 Max Mac Studio, I can confidently say that the Mac Mini is actually better in real life, not just on paper. So the difference is actually noticeable, at least for my workflow. And that's huge because the Mac Mini is a much cheaper computer than the Mac Studio, at least if you compare launch prices for both computers. But it's also not to say that this is a perfect computer, because a lot of times the 24 gigabytes of RAM this thing has is not really enough for my workflow. A lot of times you'll just start using swap memory, which isn't really an issue at the moment. It doesn't really slow down the computer in any way, but it could potentially have a negative impact on the built-in SSD, because that's what swap memory is. It just uses your SSD as RAM, but there's only a specific number of times that you can read and write on the SSD, and eventually you run out of that number and your SSD will die. So if this continues happening for a very long time, you can potentially see your SSD die much quicker than it should. But personally for me, I don't think that's really an issue, at least not right now, because I don't think I'm going to use these Macs any longer than maybe 2-3 years. And in that amount of time, that's probably not going to happen. But if you do plan to keep it for a longer time, this is something you may want to consider. And while I mentioned that the GPU inside this thing is almost as good as the Mac Studio, the downside is that the GPU is not as good as like compared to competitors, for example. For example, I compared this to an Asus laptop with an RTX 4070, which isn't the latest and greatest, by the way, and it was able to render a Blender scene significantly faster than this M4 Pro, which is almost the latest and greatest from Apple. And that's just the downside of Macs in general. It's not an issue with this computer, it's just a Mac thing. But getting back to the SSDs, one of the biggest problems I have with this Mac and even my Mac Studio is the 512 gigabytes of storage. It's just not enough. Even though I use this thing with an external 1 terabyte SSD, right now this thing is almost full, the internal SSD. So 512 gigabytes is just not cutting it for me. So that's also something you might want to consider. SSD speeds, however, are pretty good. They're not the fastest, but they are pretty fast. The SSDs inside this thing are also potentially user replaceable. I watched a video, I think one of the best videos about this computer recently, is that apparently there's a company that's working to build or reconstruct the SSDs inside these things, and they plan to sell them to the public. If that actually becomes a thing and it's widely available, that's going to be really nice. But at the time of recording this video, I don't think that exists. And that pretty much wraps my thoughts about this computer. Will I be switching to it? No. And the reason being my M1 Max Mac Studio. I think in some ways the Mac Studio might still be a better option for me, for my workflow, especially because of the ports. And I'm happy with the performance of the Mac Studio. The small upgrade that I would potentially get from this just doesn't feel like it's worth it right now.